This machine will have eyes, ears, and a voice.
This is PVP Television News.
Now, I've been asked to explain exactly what TRAPP is and where it came from. As most of you will know, in the early days, Scottish Power produced a series of plans, one of which showed a line of pylons running literally almost through the village. The Community Council were not happy with this, and I suspect most of you were not happy with it. And a group of us were asked to set ourselves up to look into this, to advise the council, and to see what alternatives could be made. This we have done. It became very obvious very early on that the only way to stop pylons coming through was actually to stop the wind farms that started it. Because as you'll appreciate, if you build a wind farm, it produces energy. That energy has got to be taken through to the substation, and then from the substation on up to join in with the national grid. If the wind farms over above Llandinam and Llanbadarn and so on over there get refused, then the pylons will not be necessary running through this. In fact, Scottish Power told us that even if one of those wind farms is refused and doesn't get built, then the pylons will not be necessary. They will be going, the lines will go somewhere else. The idea was to protect Shannon Valley, as well as local jobs in the tourist industry in particular. As a group, we have on our mailing list some 135 families within the local area, which, when you consider that there are about 300 families altogether, is quite a large proportion. And I would emphasise, the only way to stop the pylons being erected through this valley is, in our opinion, to stop the wind farms. As far as I'm concerned, they're not efficient. On average, they only produce power for 25 to 28% of the time. They require 100% backup from nuclear or traditional power stations. And according to the government advisors, if they are not built, it'll save £4.6 billion. And if they are built, according to the Prime Minister, they will add something like 25% to everyone's electricity bills to pay for the subsidising of these things.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope what I'm going to say is going to cheer and encourage you in two ways. Firstly, that underneath the political movements, there are some very deep changes in British climate change policy. And those are cheering in two ways. Firstly, it's a better approach to climate change, and we need one. And secondly, it will resolve many of the problems that are causing you so much concern. And not just you, the people all over the British Isles, in England and in Scotland too. What's going on is really related to the global picture of emissions. Let's think back to 1990 and the Kyoto Treaty. What's happened since 1990 in global climate change policy? Have emissions fallen? No. The annual emissions have risen by 45% since 1990. Chinese emissions have more than tripled in that period, and they now exceed those of the United States, which themselves have increased by 20% in that period. Climate change policy we currently have, and have had for the last 10 to 20 years, has failed. It's failed comprehensively. And the reason it's failed is that it was unaffordable and infeasible. In fact, indeed, it's so expensive that not even the developed West can afford it, and the developing world, China and India, also growing rapidly, certainly cannot afford this policy. So we have failed to offer an economically compelling example to those countries. Indeed, we've done the reverse. This chart shows progress towards the 2010 target for electricity from renewables. The red line is the target quantity, and the blue line is what we actually delivered, and the years across the bottom, from 03 to 010. And as you can see, we were never close to meeting the target. Now, you might say we didn't try hard enough. But we tried very hard. That blue line cost the British consumer £5.6 billion in subsidy to renewables. We tried very hard indeed. We didn't create a sustainable industry. We didn't create an economically compelling example for the Chinese. We wasted that money effectively. It's gone into surplus profits for investors and developers. It's been a total write-off. It's a disaster. Indeed, in the last year, it was clocking at about 1 billion a year. That's risen to round about 1.5 billion a year at present. And in order to meet the current targets in 2020, it has to rise still further. The chart you've just been looking at is down here. This red line is what the increase in renewables that we would have to see to meet the current targets in 2020, which is for about 30 to 35% of UK electricity from renewables. So that blue line cost us 5.6 billion, and it was costing 1 billion a year at this point. In order to meet the target, we'd have to increase the expenditure and subsidies to somewhere around about 7 to 8 billion a year in 2020. Now, the announcement made today is being presented by some as an increase in spending on renewables in 2020. That's not correct. The Treasury has said they are prepared to contemplate 7.6 billion a year in 2020, the figure I just mentioned. Nothing has changed. However, what the Treasury is trying to do is to slow the rate of adoption of subsidised renewables, so that this line here is flat and then rises sharply. Why do they want to do that? The total cost to the consumer is the area under the chart. If they can slow the rate of growth, they can keep the cost down. Why do they want to do that if they're going to raise the cost towards the end? Well, because they think things are going to change towards the end of this decade. The mood is changing. People are saying, we can't do this at any cost. The whole point of this is to provide something which is cheap, so that the Chinese can do that instead of burning coal. Of course, that's not what we're doing at present. So the Treasury is playing for time. But deep down, a lot of people are realising that what we've been doing for the last 10 to 15 years has been not just a failure, but actually counterproductive. It's actually held back the climate change agenda, and clean energy does matter. We've got to get this right. And Mr. Hayes, now Minister of State for Energy, is one of the most promising ministers we have had for a long time. He's a consumer champion. But he's a consumer champion in a good sense. He realises that the energy sector has got to offer a compelling example in clean energy terms. So he wants to have clean energy at an affordable price. And that involves putting a cap on current technologies. So he has written that there should be up to 13 gigawatts of onshore wind. That's quite a lot, actually. And there's only about 5 to 6 at present. So you might think there's a very big increase. But let's see what his figures actually mean in practical terms. He said that enough is enough. I'm sure that many people agree with that. And on Channel 4 News, quoted in a Telegraph article, he said, with respect to what's built, with what's consented and with a small proportion of what's in the planning system, we will have reached our ambition in respect of the renewables target. End of story. So he's still committed to the targets, but he's said, actually there's a lot consented already, so we don't need to consent very much more. That's interesting. Let's see if we can unpack it. Well, what is actually operational? Okay, this table shows the status, operational, consented, and under construction. Stuff in planning, and stuff that's been refused. This is for offshore wind, and here's the onshore wind quantity. So, operational, 5.1 gigawatts. Quite a lot. Consented and under construction, 6.7 gigawatts. In planning, another 6.7 gigawatts. About 650 applications. That's from the government database, which we think is not very accurate, but it's one of the best data sources we have. About 650 applications in the planning system. And since this all began in 02, 6.1 gigawatts has been refused. So the wind industry has a very high success rate in planning, hitherto. About 60% overall. In Scotland, it's even higher, it's about 80%, but they have a very positive planning regime. So Mr. Hayes' remark, he said, with respect of what's built, what's consented, and with a small proportion of what's in the planning system, we will have reached the summit of their ambitions. Well, what are they? So, what's built, what's consented, and a small proportion of this, he says. Okay. To get to 13 gigawatts, we only need 20% of the capacity that's currently in planning. In other words, 80% of the capacity currently in planning, causing so much anxiety around the country, can be refused. Another way of looking at it is to say that if the largest 7 wind farms are all approved, then 99%, about 640 applications, could be refused. So effectively what Mr. Hayes was saying is that we don't need to consent very much more wind. We're still assuming, of course, that what is consented will actually be built. But of course there are very sound reasons why quite a lot of it may not be built. Remember, the Treasury is playing for time. They realise that this is incredibly expensive. Currently 1.5 billion a year, somewhere around about 8 billion a year in subsidy in 2020. Total cost of the scheme on my calculations up to 2030 will be in the region of 130 to 150 billion in subsidy. That is unaffordable even for a rich country, and the UK at present is not a rich country, has many commitments in other areas. So Mr. Hayes is saying, we're going to have to cap this and keep it down. He's still saying he's committed to the targets, but there are reasons for thinking that in fact a lot of what's actually consented will not be built for fundamental economic reasons. We can't afford to pay the bill, in effect. But anyway, Mr. Hayes is doing what he can. He's getting the brakes on. So if 99% are going to be rejected, the Planning Inspectorate knows that to reach the government's targets, they do not have to privilege national capacity targets over local harms. So in the planning system, local harms, landscape, ecology, visual impact, noise, all these things which matter a great deal, not just to local people, but to all of us, all these things can be given their proper weight. I mean, in the past, I don't need to tell you, that national targets seem to have carried all before them. Nothing seems to have mattered. It's a terrible impact on a local landscape, doesn't matter, national target comes first. It's a real pain in the neck for a neighbour, doesn't matter, tough, he has to do his bit. It's noisy, tough, national targets come first. That's going to change now. You should see the Planning Inspectorate responding to a change of priorities. We have enough. Enough is enough, said Mr. Hayes. We have enough consented, only a little bit more, to meet the target. That's positive, and it's very helpful. There's a long way to go yet. The battle is not over. There are still people around who are trying to have Mr. Hayes' approach to this reversed. We have to support him, because it's in all our interests, and indeed, as I said at the beginning, it is in the interest of a sound climate change policy. If you care about climate change, you should be deeply distressed that we have spent so much money to no effect. You should be angry that speculative investors have made so much money out of a failed policy which they themselves have encouraged. I'm afraid history will not be kind on this subject. This is a scandal. It's a deeply, deeply distressing scandal on a subject which really matters. But we are thinking it over again. And here is a fascinating remark, indeed, to my mind, the most interesting thing to come out of the last 2 to 3 months of debate in political circles. Mr. Hayes, of course, has had a lot of the headlines, but look at something that Mr. Cameron said in Prime Minister's Questions. No one's commented very much on it, but you've commented. I haven't seen that, Lily. My apologies. This is highly significant. Responding to Mr. Miliband and supporting Mr. Hayes, Mr. Cameron said, we have a big pipeline of onshore and offshore wind projects that are coming through. We're committed to those, so supporting Hayes' approach, but all parties will have to have a debate in the House and outside about what happens once those targets are met. In other words, we'd see that the general approach for the last 20 years has not worked. We've got to rethink it. And what we're going to do is to take it away from those well-meaning but frankly silly people who dress up as polar bears and climb cooling towers and power stations. And we've got to get a hold of it and realise this is about economics. This is not about stunts. This is about fundamental economics and presenting an economically compelling example to the rest of the world. The renewables industry has got to grow up. It's got to do a good job. It's got to become cheaper, much, much cheaper. And it's got to become truly sustainable. In other words, it's got to stop causing deep distress to local populations all around the country. Because unless renewables work for everyone, they are not going to work at all. And that would be very sad. Thank you very much.
Wow. Any questions for Dr. Constable?
Thank you. That was sorry, it's Colin Penfold. That was very interesting, actually, your remarks and the charts and everything you put up there. And you did make one particular point about the industry itself. My feeling is that the industry itself is not primarily concerned with being green. It's primarily concerned with how much profit it's making on an annual basis. And once they started talking about reducing the amount of feedback to them, they were talking about whether we weren't going to build them. And I think that we have to look at the situation as a whole. And in my opinion, and I'd like to know what yours was, and maybe the other members of the panel, is that the only way we're really going to solve these sort of problems is to bring back energy back into public ownership, rather than being run by these private companies. That's not just true of wind farms, etc. It's true of all of it. And until we can do that, we can't really plan for the future in terms of dealing with the problems of global warming, which is very, very, very important that this is dealt with in a not too distant future. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is really, would it be better if it was all in public ownership? Well, in effect, it already is. And I'm not convinced that actually a full public ownership scheme would actually address the problems. I mean, in effect, the government has been driving energy policy ever since the year 2000. They haven't actually taken ownership of the assets, but they have so controlled the development policy that, in effect, they have been making boardroom decisions through economic incentives. So it's tempting to think that a return to the CEGB would solve the issue, but I'm afraid that many of the decisions would be then taken centrally in much the same way that they are today. I feel that it's not actually likely to be as powerful a solution as you might wish it to be. I do understand your concern about profit-driven companies, but remember those companies are operating within a regulated environment, heavily regulated. They're not operating in a truly free market. They have, National Grid, for example, has a regulated asset base and a regulated income stream. It's owned by shareholders, but its profits are determined by state bureaucratic decisions. Similarly, privately owned companies like Scottish and Southern, Scottish Power, Aon and so on, operating within a heavily regulated environment. My own view is that actually a truly liberal market in energy would solve many of these problems. Because if these subsidies were not there, you wouldn't have this kind of deeply distressing and indeed counterproductive development. That's quite a sophisticated kind of discussion to have. I understand the arguments in favour of state ownership. I'm not convinced by it myself. I feel that a truly liberal market might be better.
I would like to ask Dr. Constable a question. It's Andrew Leach. I was listening to the wireless, I think it was earlier today, maybe yesterday, and it said, with regard to nuclear, and I don't know your views on nuclear energy, but it said that the decisions for our nuclear policy are dictated by the French, who own some of the EDF, I think it was. And, you know, there's a question of national security here, as well as providing the cheapest electricity. I mean, our gas is coming from Russia or wherever, and somebody can pull the plug on that, as they did on the Ukraine, I think it was, this a couple of years ago. So what are your views for our security of energy? And do you agree with nuclear?
Should we have EDF, which is a French state-owned organisation building nuclear power stations in Britain? Well, if they can do it without subsidy, I think that might be fine, actually, provided there is real competition. Up to the present point, there hasn't been much competition, and until very recently, EDF had no real competitor at all. So they were able to name their price. And indeed, in effect, they were asking for subsidies, which was certainly not the sort of thing which I approve. Now, why were they asking for subsidies? Well, because the rest of the market was so distorted by subsidies for renewables that they could not operate without compensating subsidies. So we don't know whether nuclear can survive in a free market situation because we've never tried it, or we haven't tried it recently, or haven't made it possible for the nuclear industry to assess its prospects in a free market situation. Do I think nuclear should be built? Well, perhaps, if it can be done safely and economically. I've lived in Japan, and I live quite close to Sizewell B power station in Suffolk. And yesterday, of course, EDF announced its consultations for Sizewell C. It's about 3 miles from my house. Very close indeed. I feel it probably can be safe if it's correctly run. I want to see it correctly run if it's going to be built. I have concerns about it, as anybody who lives that close to a nuclear power station would. But I am confident that it probably could be safely run, provided there is sufficient public consultation and involvement, that we don't allow it to be hidden behind veils of secrecy. I think that was very unhelpful, and that's how the problems occurred in Japan. I know Japan very well, and my wife is Japanese. I've lived there and I speak a little bit of Japanese. And one of the problems the nuclear industry had in Japan is that it was deeply secretive. And I'm afraid that is to a degree true here, and I think that will need to change.
You mentioned towards the end of your talk about developing a sustainable form of energy production. Could you kind of elaborate a bit on what you think that might be? And certainly as well in terms of the cost of it, because you were trying to kind of make that point in relation to the cost.
So what is a sustainable solution for our energy future? Is that your...
And a cost-efficient one, obviously.
Cost-efficient one. Nobody knows, actually. And you can't know the answer to a complex question like that in advance. This is why you use the neural network of competitive markets to discover solutions to complex problems. I don't know the answer. What we need to do is to set abstract requirements and then ask investors and engineers to find the cheapest way of satisfying those requirements. So rather than telling them what to build, which is what we've been doing, we've been saying build wind farms, do this, do that. What we need to say is we want a clean and cheap energy system. Find it. And the way you do that is with a carbon tax. If we're going to head for a clean energy system, then we should have a simple, low-cost instrument like a carbon tax. The great attraction of that is that in times of economic distress, it can be reduced to take the heat off the consumer. And when you're prosperous, you can afford a higher carbon tax and then stimulate more invention and innovation in the future. My own hunch, in the short term, is that more rapid adoption of gas probably would be helpful and might be an economically compelling example to the Chinese. We need to stop the Chinese burning coal, in effect, and we can't do that unless we can offer them something cheaper. And gas might be one way of doing that. But the answer to your question really is I don't know, nobody knows. We need to engage the neural network of the world's population to address this very complex problem. And the only way you can do that is with a globally synchronized incentive mechanism, but a very low-level one, like a carbon tax. It's a very difficult diplomatic problem. I can't see it. I don't think it would be easy to have a synchronized carbon tax around the world, let alone, sorry, I'll start again. Wouldn't be easy to have a synchronized carbon tax in Europe or between the OECD, let alone globally. But it's worth talking about and thinking about.